My wife's here, but it wasn't her who clapped for me. It was my very good friend, Andy. So thank you, Andy. I am Michael Binion. I'm not sure if you know, you learn as you organize these conferences, things like that voice there, that was the voice of God. I don't know if you knew that, but I've learned that. When I first heard that, it felt slightly disrespectful, but I've come to understand that when I heard my name from the voice of God, I came out. Okay, so my job here as the chair of the Canada Strong and Free Network is actually to do a couple of admin things, but the main point is that if I manage to get people to quiet down and pay attention, so that the next speakers who you really want to listen to, that you're ready for them, that's actually my main job. I do want to just make the comment though that we're going to be close to 1,000 people registered and media, et cetera. So that'll be one of our biggest, if maybe potentially our biggest conference ever, but certainly close to one of the biggest conferences ever. It's happening, as you know, in the middle of an election. There's a lot of people who either can't be here or had other things that they needed to do during this time. And in spite of that, we're at that number. And I was asked 6 or 7 years ago now to take over as chair to lead the organization through the transition from Preston, and I'm sorry to bring you news, but Preston's wasn't nothing serious, but just wasn't feeling up to the trip, and so he's not going to be here. But he has generally been very supportive, and I've really loved to get to know him better and have him be supportive of us. But to lead that transition to really Preston Manning's organization to being our organization, and by that I mean you and all of us. And I think the attendance here and the continuous growing success we've had, and the improving finances of the organization so that we now have more staff is all a testament to that success. And it's been such an honor for me to be able to work with a growing board of directors, and I won't mention all their names, but I see you among the room, and they've been so amazing, and we have a really fantastic board renewal. As I mentioned, some of our staff, and when I first took over, we had no staff, so it's so nice to have staff, and so that's and especially when you're on a board that you're not actually also managing. And I also want to point out the sponsors. Our sponsors have grown so fast, and I want to tell you that I am a sponsor. So when I tell you that you should please thank the sponsors, I mean it so sincerely. But thank you. I do hope that you'll take the time, though, to note the sponsors and to consider, the fact that they've taken their time, their money to help us, and just consider whether there's opportunities for you to support them or to do business with them. So I hope you will. I hope you will at least do that bit after what they do for us, and of course all the people out in our booths. My wife, I saw, has been out in almost every one of them already, but there's some free socks she wanted. I know. I'm not sure she got those, but please take your time to do that as well. Okay, so now I just want to go to one very important administrative issue in the middle of a writ period. So there is in Canada this thing called election law, which restricts our freedom of speech during elections for very good reasons, I'm told. But we are not allowed to be partisan during this election, and that means that we as an organization are also not allowed and will not during this conference. And just on the last point, by the way, there will be no single federal conservative partisan speaker here. There will be some provincial politicians. There'll be no federal ones for that reason. We will, as an organization, not espouse any partisan view for any party during this time. We also will not talk about issues that are directly related to any of the politicians' campaigns. Now, on the other hand, there will be speakers here, and they are free to speak their mind, and they themselves will be in compliance with the election laws for themselves. And so certainly we may hear different speakers have different points of view, and it's my job to tell you that those views do not represent the view of Canada Strong and Free Network. And just while we're talking about some of the administrative issues, I don't know, you probably know there's a speaker later called Barry Weiss, right? And she left the New York Times because she had a disagreement about how important facts were to stories, and so we actually had Elections Canada contacted us. This is the true part of the story. They really did contact us. The not as true part of the story is they said to us, we've got a little bit of a problem that we understand you're having speakers who are going to talk about facts and common sense, and we're concerned that that's an issue associated with one party. Now, of course, I can't tell you which party that is, because it's a nonpartisan event here this time. But in any event, I'm pleased to let you know that we were able to work with Elections Canada and convince them that it has not got to the point that facts and common sense are really only one party. But we did have another issue that came up, that there is apparently counter tariffs on the importation of common sense. So we've now had to deal with the tariff on Barry Rice's on the speaking fee because of the importation of common sense, which now has the counter tariff. But I'm pleased to let you know that we talked to the people in Quebec, and a bottle of maple syrup has solved this problem. Okay, so that is the end of my administrative issues. I hope that it's impressed on you, that you understand that we're expressing no view on facts or common sense being associated with any particular party. Okay, so it's now my job, and I did mention our staff, and I didn't mention him by name, but I'm going to do it right now because I'm going to bring him out on the stage, is Adam Bullock, our new CEO, who has just done an amazing job, and I'm so pleased to have him working for us, and I know our entire board is. So with that, I'm going to invite Adam to the stage. Oh, there we go.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to be brief tonight only because I'm very excited and terribly proud of the networking conference this year, and I'm very impressed with what the team has been able to accomplish, and so I want to get right to work and right into the program. As Michael alluded to, the lawyers tell me there is something going on in this country right now that could have posed some challenges, but I think looking at this full room tonight and the impressive agenda, I think it's fair to say that the movement remains strong and united and focused at this time. So I want to thank each and every one of you who have bought a ticket and traveled to be with us if you're not living here in Ottawa. Your support is critical, and we thank you for it. One thing I will emphasize and ask of everyone in the Conservative movement tonight is this: meet each other, get to know each other, say hello. The network and the networking piece of this is one of the, I would say it's a beautiful part of Preston's vision for this organization, and also the most important. So I want you all to keep that in mind this week. Use this conference for that purpose. Connect, meet people. The movement's not as big as you think today, but every year it's getting bigger and bigger. And Michael told you we've successfully, for the last couple of years, increased our attendance at every single one of our conferences. So that's, I think, a very good sign of how healthy things are. As Michael alluded to, I also want to thank our sponsors for continuing to support us. They loyally and generously ensure we can continue to provide the chance to network and hear from amazing thought leaders on the right in this country. You're going to hear from a few of our sponsors tonight, including Rodney McDonald of Intuit and Gary Clement of TD Bank, some of our oldest sponsors, so thank you guys so much for that. And of course, we're blessed to have many gold, silver, bronze, and partner sponsors. As Michael said, if you see one, please thank them. Please thank Michael. That helps make my job easier too. And I also want to especially thank the team. My chair reminds me that even though he still says new, in private conversations he said, "This is year 2, fella. You're not new anymore." But I do want to say that although it is only my second conference, it feels like the most organized and buttoned down conference we've ever had. So I want to thank the staff, especially Zoe Lynn Ashton. Many of you know Zoe. She's been doing this for many, many years. Absolutely. She does heroic work. She pours her heart and soul into our events and into our conferences. And so there's no one that works harder than her, so thank you, Zoe. I also want to thank and welcome the newest member of our team, as Michael hinted at, our Director of Operations, Beth Green, who started just at the end of January, and she's been immersed ever since. So Beth, you can't quit till Sunday, but please stick around. I also want to thank a few other people, Daniel Perry, who's been coordinating all of our volunteers and staff, Ariella Kimmel, who's been doing a great job managing our program and keynotes. I also want to recognize Alex Spence, who's been volunteering her time to be our spokesperson and leading our media relations. I gather there's been some questions, so thanks, Alex. You've done awesome. Big thank you to all our volunteers as well, who are putting their time in to make this conference a success. And my own thanks to the board of directors, led by our chair, Michael Binion. They continue to provide me with the guidance and support I need to lead this organization. And please, if you see one of my board members, take them by the elbow, tell them we're doing a good job, tell them I'm doing a good job. Again, it makes my job just a little bit easier, especially when I tell them we need to raise more money and do more. So thank you. And a final, very special thank you to one particular member of our board, the chair of our events committee and programming committee, Kate Harrison, the vice chair of Summa Strategies. Kate's been doing this event for a number of years now on a volunteer basis, even before she joined the board. Kate is like my Oprah. She is incredibly kind and generous, and her leadership advice and experience have been absolutely invaluable to me personally, so thank you, Kate. I just want to make two important programming notes. We just heard late last night that President Novak, former president of Hungary, is not going to be able to join us. She has a herniated disc, and obviously, so she couldn't make the travel. But we do have a representative from the Prime Minister's office of Hungary, Martin, who's going to be on stage taking her place, and I think he's going to be a wonderful spokesperson for what they've achieved in Hungary, so I'm looking forward to that. And the final change, which is, I think, an important one, we have a special keynote now for 1:45 p.m. tomorrow. I believe the schedule was updated on the website. But we have joining us at the last minute the 30th Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Scott Morrison, who's going to join us for a discussion on foreign affairs, what's going on in APAC and China, and I'm sure he'll have some views on what he sees happening in the Americas as well. And that's going to be, that discussion is going to be had by a member of our Board of Directors, Mr. Ray Novak. So thank you, Ray, and thank you, Prime Minister, for joining us. I'm now pleased to welcome to the podium one of CSFN's strongest supporters and sponsors, both personally and professionally through his organization. He's a dear friend, he's a mentor to me and to many young conservatives in the movement, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Gary Clement of TD Bank.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Adam mentioned, I'm Gary Clement, Director of Government Relations for TD Bank Group. And just want to say it's my honor to be here representing TD. As Adam mentioned, we have been a long-standing sponsor and partner of Canada Strong and Free, and also it's a precursor of the Manning Centre. And at TD, we believe in public policy and encourage Canadians to debate the issues and get better informed, and there's no better place to do that than at this conference. I have to say, I've been looking forward to this conference and the opportunity to connect with so many conservative-minded people across the country. Getting the opportunity to hear from all the dynamic speakers that are lined up for the next few days is a real treat, and I just want to thank Adam and his team for putting together a fantastic program. As sponsors, we're very appreciative. We've got two great people with us this evening to kick off the conference. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator, John Walsh. John is currently the General Counsel of Timber Creek Capital and has had a long and successful career in corporate finance and law. He also has deep roots in the conservative movement, having been a former conservative political staffer at the provincial and federal level, though he may be more recognizable to some of you as the past Conservative Party president from 2009 to 2018 under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And joining John on stage is Chad Wolfe, the former acting secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security under the first Trump administration, and the current executive vice president, chief strategy officer, and chair of the Center for Homeland Security and Immigration for the America First Policy Institute. The America First Policy Institute, founded in 2021, is one of the leading right-wing nonprofit think tanks in America and has had significant influence on the policy agenda in that country. Secretary Wolfe is responsible for the day-to-day management and strategic direction of the Institute, with a focus on setting policy goals and research priorities. During his time at Homeland Security, Secretary Wolfe successfully navigated numerous global and domestic challenges to America's security, including COVID-19, civil unrest, numerous border and immigration crises, historic natural disasters, and threats to global aviation security. With the unprecedented times we are in, both domestically and internationally, he brings a wealth of experience and insights on how the current Trump administration will deal with the issues before them and how us as conservatives should be thinking on how to navigate the reshaping of global security and prosperity. Having spoken extensively on national security, border security, immigration, China, and counterterrorism issues, I'm truly looking forward to his remarks tonight. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Chad Wolfe and John Walsh.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome, everybody. As we were just saying, kicking off a conference is never the spot in the order you're dying for, but I think we're going to get things going in the right direction and a serious conversation about serious issues. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. Thanks for being willing to kick things off and to talk about the issues that are really on a lot of people's minds, certainly in this country and certainly in yours as well. Why don't we start with a term that I don't think 10 years ago people talked much about, but it's pretty much the top of everyone's mind on both sides of the border, and that's border security. For your country, we've always assumed that the southern border was the only focus, but obviously now President Trump and a lot of people are talking about border security in the United States on both ends, north and south. Why don't you walk us through where the mindset of the administration is on those issues?
Yeah, well, John, thanks, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. As I say, anytime I'm able to get outside of D.C., it's a good day. So it's good to be with everyone. I like how you phrased it, border security. Usually when I go and talk to groups or talk to anyone else, they say, well, what about immigration? You know, what are we going to do about immigration? And I like to talk about those two terms very, very differently, because one is border security, one is the sovereignty of your country, and how do you let people in, knowing who they are, how are they vetted, what do they want to come into the country for? And then there's immigration, which is legal immigration, and how folks legally come to your country for a variety of different reasons. So I like how you phrase that, because those are two different terms in my view. Obviously, President Trump, going all the way back to 2015 and 16, was very focused on the illegal immigration side, folks coming to the United States illegally, and really focused his time and attention during the first term. And then, of course, we had the preceding 4 years of the Biden administration, which is just historically bad on this issue. And I think, you could disagree, but I think it was probably the top or the second issue that got him elected. It was probably the economy. It was probably immigration and border security, and then there were a few of the social issues, which I'm sure you guys will talk about. And so what you see today is a very deliberate approach to getting that specifically the southern border under control. A lot of people in the United States don't realize we have two borders. They focus almost exclusively on the southern border, and just by the sheer numbers, the threats, the human trafficking, the illegal narcotics. I mean, it's where the game is at. It's from all statistics. That's the problem. 2,000 miles of very difficult terrain to patrol versus the 4,000 to 5,000 miles that we have on our northern border, which is a different topic and a different strategy. But the team right now under President Trump has gone in these first 60 to 65 days and have done things that we had talked about for a couple years during the Biden administration to say, look, if President Trump got another shot at this, how could we do things differently, building on what we did during what I call Trump 1.0. And the speed and the velocity at which they have moved has been absolutely incredible. You've seen numbers, illegal apprehension numbers along that southern border drop over 94%. And if you were to say, hey, is that achievable 6 months ago, this quickly, I would have said absolutely no way. There's no way to do that quickly, but they have. And I think they're getting a lot of results, and I think they're going to keep going. They're tackling this from a variety of different ways, right? From birthright citizenship to making sure that there's consequences for illegal activity, which is really kind of what we didn't see during the Biden administration, which was come on in, and even if you come illegally, nothing's going to happen to you, right? And so if you're DHS and you're a law enforcement agency, that's built on deterrence. The only reason that people are going to pay attention to you is if you do something bad and you do something wrong, there's a consequence to that. And if you don't enforce the law and there's no consequence, well, we saw what we saw during the 4 years of the Biden administration. So southern border is, I'm not going to say it's under control because it's not just yet, but there's a lot of improvements there. I think at some point, and Secretary Noem, I think, made her first or second visit to the northern border, and that wasn't by just pure luck or circumstance. I think that was a deliberate act to say, we are going to get the southern border under control, but there is what some would say is an emerging issue along the U.S. northern border with our friends in Canada. And so different set of problems there, different set of solutions that have to be allocated towards it. I think over probably the next couple of years, that's probably where the administration and the department you'll start to see and hear a lot of more activity about the challenges along the northern border and what are those solution sets.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. That helps frame the 90-10 thing that we think in Canada is probably true. Once the president was reelected in the fall, there was a significant reaction, specifically by the premiers of the provinces across the border, and most of them reacted by saying, we don't disagree that needs to be tightened up, and they did what they could do from a provincial level to start to do that. And the federal government certainly said that they were working in that direction as well. Has that been noticed, do you think, by, well, I'll use your lingo, Trump 2.0, or is it hard to get attention when so much of the focus is on the southern border?
No, I think it has been noticed, and particularly by some in the White House, but even at the departmental level, the folks that interact with officials in Canada or in Mexico kind of on a daily basis, they track that. I know we did when I was at the department. You track the progress, you track what they're doing very intentionally, because you have a lot of asks for them, right? And so I imagine that the ask from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and other elements of the federal government, U.S., to Canadian officials is growing by the day, right? Mm-hmm. And so the asks just don't go in and someone says, oh, well, we asked, let's see, those asks get tracked very closely to determine, do we have a good partnership here? Is this working? Is it not working? And so you have a different mindset, under 4 years of President Biden. As I would say, it's very difficult to ask your friends to the north and the south to do more when they refuse to do anything. Mm-hmm. But President Trump is saying, look, he's doing a lot, and he's trying to enforce U.S. law. He's taken a lot of executive action. And so now that team is saying, now our partners need to do more and step up to it. And I think that's what you'll see. I found during Trump 1.0, I get asked the question a lot of, well, how does this work with the government of Mexico, Central America, maybe even Canada to a certain extent? What I found to be the most beneficial is, and you hear this a little bit with President Trump, and he's a businessman, right? It's transactional. Mm-hmm. You'll get something if we get something. And this idea of, foreign policy discussions and cables and demarches going back and forth, all of it leads to nothing. Right, in my experience, or it leads to something 12 months away. And what we say, for those of us that worked in the Trump administration, is you're on Trump time, which things cannot happen in months. We're talking days and weeks. Right. And that is a little different and a little difficult for folks in D.C. to contemplate and wrap their head around. But I do think it's beneficial and it is working. I think the American people see it as well, and they like that action.
Yeah. We wish we didn't know the word fentanyl, and we didn't use that word before, 10 years ago. Yep. The interwoven complexity of the Chinese, fentanyl, northern border security. Yep. Obviously, when the president first introduced the concept of the T word, which we'll get to in a bit, but let's try and cover some ground before we get there.
I didn't think we were going to talk about that.
I don't know if it's possible to avoid it, Mr. Secretary, but I'm interested in your thoughts about that, because certainly the president emphasized fentanyl as one of the two issues on the border that he was focused on, and I think there's a Chinese element to that, certainly. Why don't you walk us through your thoughts on that?
Well, he was on this issue, going back to 2017 and 2018, when what we saw in the U.S., it started to spike. And in his administration, we worked with Congress. We passed a pretty good piece of legislation, because at that time, the fentanyl was coming in from China through express consignment carriers, right? The FedExes, the DHLs of the world coming into the United States. So we put some measures in place where that significantly went down or almost exclusively stopped. And what we saw is then they started going to Mexico. right? So then it started to be shipped in Mexico and then smuggled across the border. And then that's kind of where we found ourselves in 20 throughout the Biden administration and sort of the challenge that we see today. And so the president is not, new to this issue. If you remember during 1.0, Kellyanne Conway, which was a senior counselor to the president, this was one of her main issues, which was the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And hers was more on the prevention side and the treatment side. And then others of us were on the enforcement side. And so I think what you'll find with President Trump is he may be somewhat new to the political kind of atmosphere and game, but he has a lot of opinions on these issues going back years. And this is one that he feels very, very deeply about. And it's not just a talking point. It's not just, I want to do something about the fentanyl crisis plaguing American communities. He is going to do something. Obviously we see that with some of the tariffs and some of the action that he wants to see from both Mexico and Canada. But my guess is over these next 3.5 years, you're going to continue to see more and more emphasis put on the whole spectrum when we talk about fentanyl, from the enforcement to the treatment to how do you classify it, perhaps as a Class 1 drug in the United States, which gives you different enforcement priorities. So there's a variety of different things I think that this administration will really lean into when it comes to fentanyl.
If you were, obviously, not trying to sound defensive for Canada, but obviously the magnitude of the issue on north and south border is different, but not denying that it isn't an issue. I think there was a 60 Minutes episode not that long ago talking anecdotally about, Mexican cartels shipping through Canada because the southern border had become more complicated. If you were advising whoever will be the new government in Canada in a couple of weeks, what could we be doing better to stop the inflow? The outflow to the U.S. is really U.S. immigration and border security going that way, but it's got to get here first. What should we be doing more with respect to Chinese inflow of fentanyl? Is there a way that you've done, you talked about the purulators of the world. Is that similar to what's happening here? How is the fentanyl getting here?
Yeah, I would assume, look, I get asked the question a lot about southern versus the northern border, and it's not just geography, it's also about your partners.
Yeah.
And the Mexican government is I'll try to be nice, is limited in what they can do, right?
Yep.
Some would go so far as to say they are compromised in what they can do as far as stopping the human trafficking and the illegal narcotics with the cartels.
Right.
We have a different type of partnership with the Canadian government, right? It's much more difficult to come into Canada than it is Mexico, right? There are visa-free places in South America where you can just fly into Mexico without a visa and then make your way to the southern border. Can't really do that here. No. And so I think overall, not only is the problem different, the challenge is different, the solution set's different because you have different types of immigration systems in play. And so the difficulty of coming into Canada, I think there are obviously things that you can do here in Canada that can probably beef that up. Probably one of my recommendations is to have officials say, hey, what has worked in the U.S. and what hasn't? Mm-hmm. And perhaps we can apply some of that here. And perhaps we've gone further than that already. And the challenge here is just dramatically different than what you see in the United States. But you can start with the express consignments. I think you can start with a lot of that. What we see in Mexico now is a lot of that fentanyl is being produced there. Mm-hmm. You get the precursors from China, but it's being produced. I don't know if that's the case here in Canada. My guess is probably not in mass quantity. The cartels are doing it there in Mexico because they operate in some ungoverned lands in Mexico, so they have the ability to do that. So my guess is you have the challenges are a little different here. And when I look at the scale, the scale of the fentanyl and the human trafficking along the southern border is really, really large in comparison to the northern border. Mm-hmm. And so you have different challenges which require different solutions, and in my mind, would require different ways to go about that, right? And so we hear about tariffs a lot, and we hear about other things. I I would personally, I would land harder on Mexico than Canada because the challenge and the significance of what's going on is much greater in Mexico.
Right.
Coming across. All that's to say, I think what the president and the team is looking at over time, historically, over these past 4 to 5 years, is a growing problem along the northern border.
Right.
And so they want to kind of address that before it becomes an even bigger issue.
That's helpful. You mentioned earlier in the conversation the distinction between border security and illegal immigration and the issue of legal immigration. And you would be forgiven for not following it as closely as we all do, but the issue of legal immigration in Canada certainly found a spotlight in the last few years between the two leading political parties on the issue of what you do with people who you legally allow into your country and whether or not you can create follow-on problems, whether it be in housing or other infrastructure, employment, but also in integration and protest and
Sure.
all those kinds of issues. The U.S. obviously has had an illegal immigration problem. We don't hear talk of legal immigration in the U.S., but it's really the focus here in Canada. Any thoughts on that and how all of those things affect Homeland Security?
Yeah, I think, in the U.S., the two are somewhat tied together because in theory, you have people coming illegally for jobs, the American dream, because they can't get in legally, right? And so the two are, I'm not sure I subscribe to that, but that's kind of like, what people talk about. I think for the most part, what you'll find from conservatives in the U.S., and I think the Trump team, at least during the first term, believe this, is you've got to solve the illegal problem first before you can start reforming the legal immigration system in the U.S., which needs to be reformed. It's decades old. It's not built for the economy that the U.S. has today and the skill set and the labor force that we need. So absolutely it needs to be addressed. But if you're any person in the world that can walk across that border as we saw during the Biden administration, sit down, have Border Patrol pick you up, go to a station, give you a plane ticket to go to Chicago for you to have a work permit 2 months later, and you get to work, why would you come in legally, wait in line, get vetted? There's no reason to, right? So you've got to fix the illegal side, and when you do that, now let's start talking about the legal immigration part of the United States. And I would say, for the most part, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me as I looked at it during service. We have lotteries for people who get green cards, right? Versus like merit-based. What does the United States need for its economy? Who's going to be productive citizens? That's why during the Trump administration, we tried to do a variety of things. Something called the public charge rule, which was basically to say if you're going to come into the United States on one of these like lottery visas, you can't go right onto welfare. You can't, take taxpayer dollars to get all these benefits and be that public charge. You had to come in and support yourself, or you had to have a sponsor that supported you. Of course, the Biden team rolled that back with most other things. And so I think those are common sense things that the majority of Americans agree with. It's not how our current immigration system is built. And so to answer your question, when I look at what are the consequences, what we saw during 4 years of Biden were the consequences of illegal immigration. It was what does it do to public health systems, where you have millions, right? We had probably somewhere between 12 and 16 million come into the United States over 4 years. Majority of those folks don't have health insurance. And so this is just one example. And so when they get sick, they go to the emergency room. Well, what does that do to Americans who actually need that emergency services? They're jammed up and they have to go elsewhere. So there are some downstream effects that we saw in the United States for 4 years, probably we'll still see it, of illegal immigration. You've got to have the ability to control who comes into your country. You have to have the ability to know who they are, why they're coming in, vet them appropriately. And what I just said, I'm sure it makes sense to everyone here, it's not how the U.S. immigration system works. You have people on the left, particularly, that just, they called me, they called other folks that served in the Trump, Nazis. we hate immigrants. We hate people of color. And you're just like, what are you even talking about? Like, even during the 4 years of the Trump administration, we gave out over 1 million green cards every year. We are the most welcoming country in the world by far. What we have a problem with is if you're going to break our law, if the first thing that you want to do to come into the United States is to break our law, we're going to have a problem with that.
Right.
And there's got to be accountability for that. And I think that's what the Trump team's doing today.
Right. One of the things that gets talked about a lot here in Canada is that until recently, and I subscribe to this, I think probably most people here would, that we had a consensus, a unique consensus on immigration. It's not very common in a nation where all sides, all across the political spectrum, generally had the same view of legal immigration, that was necessary. We're a very big country with not enough people. Economic growth is dependent on immigration, very intentional immigration, fast tracking people with capital or jobs,
right,
or sponsorship in families. And that isn't the only way you can immigrate to Canada, but once we changed that and we did not have the resource, whether it's housing or social care or health care, to support the levels of immigration, that consensus eroded. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on you touched on it, but ensuring that if you're going to legally let people into your country, that you aren't just leaving them at the airport, or what we're doing now, buying hotels and moving families into squalor because we didn't plan for the guests to arrive.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, no, I think for the most part, at least over half the country in the United States would feel the same way, and we saw that. When you have folks coming in, now obviously the United States is a little bit larger, and so there's more places and communities that they're able to assimilate into that have some of that infrastructure, but particularly along that southern border, when you have an unplanned growth or an unplanned, what the president would say is an invasion of folks coming across that border illegally, and you don't have the infrastructure built for that, that becomes a problem, and I think you lose public sentiment.
Yeah.
So the Biden administration, if you recall, back in 20, when after they won and they came into office in 21, they thought they had a great mandate to undo a lot of what Trump did on the immigration front. They went so far so quickly that I think it went the other way on them. Mm-hmm. And Americans were like, this is not what we signed up for, to have folks just on street corners, or to your point, in New York City having to buy hotels, and rent out hotels. And when you have Americans that are having a hard time, putting food on the table, and then turn around and seeing, folks that have not waited in line sitting in a hotel room, getting public benefits, getting a plane ticket or a bus ticket, and then can get a number of public benefits, they're saying, well, this isn't. And for Americans, I do believe this, there's a basic sense of fairness. And I think what they saw is that's not fair. This is not what the United States is about. Right. We're about helping people. We're happy to help people. But just handout after handout after handout is not kind of what we're about. Now, when you talk about legal folks coming in, that's why we thought that what I mentioned earlier, the public charge regulation was so important, to say, look, you can come into the United States, but you've got to be almost self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. You can't just go on welfare. You can't be a blight on society and start on the government dime here. And I think that that's an important concept that either you agree with or maybe you don't agree with. And there may be exceptions, but the United States system is not built on that. Mm-hmm. People come in, like I said, from a lottery system. If you have family in the United States, you can come in on a green card and get sponsored in, whether you have a job or not, whether you're self-sustainable or not, right? It just doesn't make sense anymore. It may have made sense, which is arguable, decades ago. Mm-hmm. It does not make sense today, but I think the ability for folks to come in to the United States or Canada, be self-sufficient, have that infrastructure is a really big piece of it. That's why for a country to be able to control who comes in and who doesn't based on their resources mm-hmm. is a really, really fundamental concept. Mm-hmm. Sounds like you guys are doing it. We haven't done that in the United States in a long time. And so when the last part here, and so when President Trump, probably about 45 days ago, maybe 50 days ago, suspended our refugee admissions program, right? And the left went crazy, right, as they normally do on most things. They said, well, how could you do that? You're gonna stop people from truly need. And we had to remind them that we have 12 million refugees that showed up at our border over the last 4 years. Like, how many more do you want?
Right.
And there's got to be other places in the world that these folks can go to. There are limits to your point, which is why I'm bringing it up. There are limits to what even the United States can sustain over a short period of time.
That's helpful to understand. Thank you. The two issues, and we won't be able to avoid talking about tariffs for much longer, but the two issues that were raised when President Trump was elected with respect to tariffs as the cudgel, if you will, were fentanyl, which we've talked about. The other one was military spending.
Yep.
And obviously a hot topic here in Canada because there are segments of the Canadian population who believe we have not been pulling our weight internationally with respect to NATO, et cetera. I'm more interested in your thoughts with respect to hemispheric security and us not potentially not pulling our weight with military spending with NORAD. And you don't need to talk about the North. We talk about it a lot, but there's a lot of talk, and certainly the president made it clear he was unhappy with our lack of spending militarily. What are your thoughts on that subject, and how concerned should we be about that?
Well, I would venture to say that the president's probably unhappy with a lot of countries spending.
Of course, yeah.
So it's probably not just specific to Canada. I think overall, I would say that, and I think you've already seen this with Secretary Rubio, his first trip internationally was to Central America. I think overall, you're seeing a realignment a little bit, at least with the Trump administration, on a focus on the Western Hemisphere. More so, even more so than they did during the first term, which was more than previous administrations have done. If you're in the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. or the national security establishment and you want to talk about issues, you don't talk about anything in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
You just don't. You talk about things in Europe and Asia, Middle East, and it's also where the military, we send our military for the most part. And I think President Trump, again, from that America First approach is, okay, that's great, and we have allies and we have alliances, and he understands all that, and there's commitments there, got it, but what about our southern border, right? And we talked about fentanyl. To my knowledge, there's no place in the world that kills between 70,000 and 100,000 Americans in a single year, but fentanyl does in the United States. And so when the president says, well, what are we doing about that? And there's very little military resources dedicated, very few intelligence resources dedicated to understanding how this is happening, he's not happy, right? And so you see a different...
We're pretty clear on that.
Yeah. He's not happy, and he's saying, I'm taking care of America first.
Yep.
Both Southern and Northern. And it's not, again, it's not a tagline, it's not a talking point. Like, it's real. And these are conversations that happen every day in the White House about these issues. It's not sort of one thing and then they move on to the next. It's every day. How is the goal? Because whether you like him or not, he made certain commitments and he intends to stick to those commitments.
Right.
And so how are these commitments being honored by our partners? And then what's the progress to that? So I think, I think there will be, if you follow this stuff closely as I do, there is definitely more of a focus on the Western Hemisphere, which includes NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, and others for the United States across the board. When you talk about defense, and I think it's the Gold Dome, right? It's not the Iron Dome, but it's the Gold Dome, right? That he's talking about as well. So I think they've got a lot of different ideas that you're going to see rolled out that talks about security of North America, security of the U.S., but it's also going to impact folks in the hemisphere as well.
It's interesting you mentioned the tie-in to the tragic deaths that lead from fentanyl overdose. The Conservative Party actually has an ad out right now where they talk about overdose deaths and the magnitude of those in Canada compared to the losses we experienced as a nation in World War II.
Yeah.
When you start framing it like that, you start to truly understand the magnitude of the issue. And so we might not love exactly how it's playing out, but I think there are a lot of Canadians who certainly agree that there's a pretty significant problem.
Yeah, the analogy that we used to use was basically a 747 going down inside the United States every single day.
Wow.
And that's the number of U.S. citizens that we were losing in the United States every day. So it's a big issue.
Mind, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it focuses that a little bit. And I think that's why the president's really, he's met with survivors, he's met with victims. I know he's met with several families that have lost, children, high school aged children to this. I've got 2 high school aged, senior and a junior, and a couple years ago, and I still have these conversations. You have to have these very uncomfortable conversations of when they go out at night, don't do anything stupid, right?
Yep,
Don't put anything in your body that you like, because you don't know.
Yep.
And that much is lethal.
Yep. Well, we've now danced around it enough. The 2 issues that were raised with respect to tariffs are both border security on the northern border with respect to general security and fentanyl being mentioned as the primary issue, and defense spending. Originally, back in, call it November, December, the message to Canada was, these are my 2 concerns, the president speaking, and if they aren't addressed, the punishment for not addressing them is tariffs. So suffice it to say, there's been a lot of twists and turns in that story since then. Tariffs, no tariffs.
Including today.
Yeah, well, I'm moving up in the calendar to today, where I think it's safe to say the leadership of the country and all political stripes, the people of the country, don't really know what the president wants from us, if I'm extrapolating. Those of us who pay a lot of attention to the economy would really like to know, because the devastation of a non-free trade northern border for the United States has a really big impact on us. And we loved, in the term that you served in, the dedication to the free trade agreement and the renewal of it. What if you were advising whoever becomes the Prime Minister of Canada after the next election as to how to get back on track with the president regarding trade and the free flow of goods, people, and money across the border, what is it that you think he really is looking for in order for us to, obviously it's not as bad as it was advertised, I think, depending on which day you look at in terms of, I'm not trying to be glib, but it has been hard to try and follow what it is that we can do to try and mitigate the harm that's created through isolationist tariffs with us. We care about the rest of the world to some degree, but we really care about us. What's the advice you'd give in that regard, if you can?
Well, let me say, I think you have Ambassador Robert Lighthizer coming to speak to you guys, so he's the foremost expert. So whatever I say is probably going to be wrong.
We'll check it with him on Friday.
Right.
Yeah.
But I did talk with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said, look, Chad, if anyone tells you they know what's going on, they don't know what's going on, right? Because it does change.
That's not encouraging,
it changes.
Secretary.
It's funny because a lot of people, they're like, sorry, get off topic here for a
No, do it.
They're like, it seems so chaotic, it being, the Trump administration. And I have to remind them that's a feature, not a bug.
Yep.
That's by design.
We're
and
starting
people
to
are
get
like,
that.
wow, why is that by design? Again, business approach to this, a chaotic business approach. But it's an approach that has worked well, both in business for the president, but also during the first term. So feature, not a bug, is the first thing I would say. Look, when I look at the tariff, we'll call it the tariff debate that's going on right now, a couple of things I see out of the White House are, what are the reasons for tariffs, right? Obviously, there's the economic trade imbalance that the president feels very passionately about. You hear this quite often in the States. America's being ripped off for years and years. Now, that primarily applies to China more than anyone else, but And so there's an economic kind of back and forth to that. Two is a security piece of it. Obviously, we've mentioned it here, both with Canada and Mexico on the fentanyl, on the human trafficking piece of it. And then just recently is a third reason, which I thought was interesting, which is actually a revenue raiser that we've heard Peter Navarro talk about, an advisor to the president, talk about billions coming in because of what we'll see in the United States. So I look at those three reasons those are, at least from what I can tell coming out of the White House, those are the reasons why you would impose tariffs, either reciprocal tariffs or across the board tariffs, whatever it might be. And so I think that all three of those are at play all at the same time. Like it's not just one or the other, it's all at the same time that the president is looking at. So again, Ambassador Lighthizer will have some great insight into this, but he truly does believe this. I think if you go back 20 years, 30 years, before he was in politics, he's talking about the trade imbalance. He's talking about how the U.S. is getting ripped. He's talking about tariff implementation and things of this nature. So, and then you just saw today, right, which is, I have to remind people, like, go back and read the book, The Art of the Deal, right? And so he's now suspended. It's now, I think, at
90 days?
Yeah, 90 days because he wants to make a deal, right? But he wasn't getting people to the table, right? You can't just say, oh, it's bad, come to the table. There's got to be some pain. At least this is how I'm looking at it. There's got to be some pain involved, and you see that. Now, we've got some partners probably here in Canada that are saying, well, that's chaotic.
Yeah.
Like the markets, everything else. Like, let's maybe not do it that way. But again, president won the election. Our talking heads on cable TV didn't. And this is what the American people, they knew exactly what they were voting for.
Right.
He did not hide what he wanted to do across the board on this issue, on immigration, on any other issues that you'll probably talk about this weekend. This is the change agent that they wanted, and they got it.
Yeah. Well, I find that a bit encouraging, actually, because there are days where others, the government, Canadians feel like it's chaos for chaos's sake, and that there's the realization that, oh my goodness, the markets are that far down, we need to pull back. It's a little more encouraging to think of it as strategy. I'd like to think that's true. Some days it's hard to believe that, but I'm going to take your word on that.
Right.
And so, it's the day after the election here in a couple of weeks, and whoever's prime minister is going to Washington to have that negotiation, have that conversation. If you were, I know you would be advising the other side, but if you were to imagine advising a Canadian prime minister on that negotiation, is it better to come in, I hate to use the phrase, elbows up, and ready to fight and defiant? Or I can't imagine obsequious is the approach, but is it behind closed doors recognizing that that's where we're at and saying, hey, you want a deal, let's talk deal? Or is it, do you need to kiss the ring, or do you need to?
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
It's all of the above. I would probably advise not to do the Zelensky approach. You probably don't want to do that. Okay. That'll get you a certain reaction you don't want. But look, the president, I think, respects folks that come in and fight for their position. They're going to fight for their country. They're going to fight what's right for them. At the same time, he wants results. And so I think you see a lot of countries around the world that have just given lip service to things that the United States has asked for over a period of time because no one's held them accountable. So what would I advise? I would say, come with an action plan that's going to deliver results quickly. And if you can't do that, then you have what you have now, which is, okay, we're going to do a fentanyl czar, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and then you got the president 30 or 60 days later saying, well, I haven't seen really anything results. Right? And then I'm sure the Canadian folks are saying, well, it takes time.
Yeah, but
right?
He doesn't operate on the same calendar that everybody else
right? It goes back to the Trump time, right? And so you've got to figure out what can get you some immediate wins quickly so that can sustain the longer term effort that you need as well. And there's got to be the right balance of both. I would say think big, think bold. The president obviously is doing things in the United States that haven't been done before.
Right.
He likes to see others do the same, right? And so there's some, I'm not saying you need to be like President Trump. Everyone's country is different. But there are some things that I think would probably go over well.
Yeah.
Again, if I was advising
Yeah.
on kind of how to approach the Trump administration on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the concern with that approach is that you do damage to the relationship. And I'm not trying to predict, but the fact that, flights to the U.S. out of Canada are way, way down. I don't think the governor of Florida is loving all the Canadian money that isn't showing up. The Windsor-Detroit border and cars going back and forth or not going back and forth is leaving a lasting impression. And to put it bluntly, Canadians are pissed off, understandably. I know what the argument on the other side of that is, and it's a legitimate one. But how do you negotiate the art of the deal that way, and have a partner after the negotiation? Any thoughts on whether or not we,
Yeah.
how should we take this at the end of the day? It's hard to say, okay, we've got a tough partner and who negotiated tough, and the deal's done now, and let's move on. I assume that's what you would think that we should be doing after the fact.
I don't know. I think it's always a negotiation. There's always room to go in and talk to the White House or whoever it is in the government that you're the interlocutor for. But
Right.
I don't think it's just, you make the deal on Monday and then you don't revisit it, right?
Right.
You make the deal and then you continue
Constant conversation.
It's
Yeah.
a constant conversation.
Right.
And you see where the pain points are. And as I used to say to folks, serving for President Trump, and there were lots of times, not just the president, but other parts of the government, my approach was always, we would say, hey, let's do X, whatever X was, right? And so in this case, it's fentanyl or whatever it might be.
Yep.
And there were times where I understood what was being asked, and it made perfect sense, and it was completely rational. I just knew we couldn't get there. We couldn't get there, probably for 6 or 9 months because of the wheels of government inside DHS or state. They weren't working fast enough. And so what some folks would do, I saw this in the first Trump White House, was, President, we can't do that, sorry. Those people usually didn't stick around very long.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is I can get you an 80% solution while I work on the 100% solution. But I can't do 100% for these, 10 reasons.
Right.
And they're all legitimate reasons. But find that 80% solution with a plan to get close to 100 or however close you can get in a certain time frame.
Right.
And then stick to the time frame, right? And so there were times that I would go in and brief the president, and he would say, hey, last time you said, and I would be like, I can't believe you remembered that. Given all the different meetings you have,
That's an
a
annoying boss
briefing
to remember things like that.
we provided you 2 months ago. Now this was usually on the wall, he cared a lot about that. And so it was sort of like, where are you? And so it's always a negotiation, and you just got to improve a little bit every time. I'm not sure that's great advice, but that's kind of how I would approach it, which is to say, I know what your goal is, Mr. President. We agree with that goal, if you do. We've got a plan, can't get you there all the way, but in the interim, I am going to give you a plan, and then just stick with the plan and deliver results. And I think you'll find an accommodating White House to a degree. Yeah.
Got it.
Again, let me preference all this because I think there's some media in the room. I don't speak for the White House.
Fair enough.
As I like to say, the president speaks for himself and does a pretty good job at it.
Yep.
This is just based on working
no,
for him.
we appreciate the insights, and we totally get that perspective. We go just a little further afield, but we kind of touched on it earlier in the conversation when we talked about immigration, and one of the, certainly in Canada, very true in the United States on university campuses, but one of the follow-ons from the current environment are a level of protest, domestic protests, that we haven't seen before. You in the United States have certainly seen it on campuses. We see it on campuses and in downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa on a regular basis. The protests in Canada and on the university campus in the US are generally about one thing. They're about Israel, and they're about the conflict in Gaza. And I know that isn't Homeland necessarily, but it certainly has Homeland implications. Why don't you bridge that gap for me and how you think about it?
Well, sure. Obviously, the president's got a lot of views on this, and this is, again, one of these issues. I talked about fairness. I talked about sort of common sense that a lot of Americans have, and they see I'm from Texas. You see a little bit of that in Texas, but you really see it in Columbia, Harvard, sort of Northeast schools and California schools, the coast, like as we like to say, the coast. And if you're sitting in Dallas, where I grew up, and you're looking at these protests, and you're like, what is going on? Why do these people hate America so much? That's their opinion. That's fine. But do we really let them in the country to espouse for a foreign terrorist organization? And I think that's what President Trump is saying. Is particularly if you're here, if you're in the United States on a student visa, legal permanent resident, what we call an LPR, most of our immigration benefits are just that. They are a benefit. They are not a right. No one in the world has a right to come to the United States. It's a benefit provided by the United States government to people to come in. And if you're a student, you have to adhere to certain standards and requirements of your student visa. No one's ever enforced that. I mean, across Republican and Democrat administrations, no one's ever enforced that. Trump team is now. They're saying, look, you don't have a right to a student visa. Right. But if you do come here and we do provide you one, and then you go out on campus and you advocate for a foreign terrorist organization like Hamas, guess what? You don't get to do that in the United States any longer.
Yeah, hear, hear.
We're going to deport you.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. And you can do it back home.
Yeah.
You can do it anywhere else.
Yeah.
And what the left does, and they do this so well, and I get into shouting matches with them. They try to frame this around the First Amendment in the United States, right? Oh, it's a freedom of expression. BS, right? Yeah. I'm all for First Amendment speech, and we have protests every day about every issue you can imagine. There is a point where it crosses a line, and you got to figure out where that line is, and the courts in the U.S. have defined that line. It's why you can't stand up in a room like this and yell fire. Right? You will get arrested if there's no fire, right, in the United States. There are limits on that speech. And so when you are espousing the destruction of America, advocating and espousing terrorist views inside the United States, you can't hide behind the First Amendment any longer, is what the Trump team is saying. And I agree with them 100%.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of agreement in the room, obviously.
Yeah.
And I like that as we come toward the close, we're back on very common ground. I think certainly in Canada, on a lot of variety of different political points in the spectrum, but certainly the right of center, there's a deep connection with the state of Israel to start with. There's understandable offense at the point you just made of people advocating for an international terrorist organization that does harm both here and obviously elsewhere. And the way in which that weaves into security, to immigration, to the infrastructure to handle immigration, you wouldn't need to know this, but one of the problems we've had is the student visa and the campuses that are running because of international students coming in, staying, and doing a lot of protesting. So I think that really weaves it all together in a way that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I'll kind of end on this. I think, look, Canada's a great partner to the United States. The President Trump, is about relationships. And for whatever reason, didn't have a great relationship with your former. Let's put it that way. And so
I don't think I'm allowed to comment on that, but right. Suffice to say we understand. Yeah.
So does that cloud things? Perhaps. But, does business on relationships I've seen him do it in the first term. A lot of this is relationships, in addition to other things. I mean, it's never just one thing. So if I say one thing, it's usually 6 things. But he is relationship-based, and so I think that's a big part. So if he can find a partner here,
Yeah.
I think you'll see as he has found partners in other parts of the world, you see different results, you see a different attitude, you just see differences.
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful that partner can be found here.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Secretary, first of all, thank you for your time. Thank you for the 4-hour flight delay and getting up here and all the hassle that goes along with that. We really appreciate your candor and your views. And I'll just finish by saying, I think we in Canada are hopeful about a past friendship that has been so close that's strained right now because of a lot of the things we've just discussed, but one where the world, we didn't talk about northern security and the importance of the Canadian North to the world, and it's becoming more and more important for trade and for security and the other actors who are at the top of the globe. But this partnership, this relationship, is the most important and among the most important in the world. And the Brits like to say they have a special relationship. We don't even need to label ours because it's that important.
Right.
And we are looking forward to getting back to that place. And I think conversation and dialogue and learning about your views and the views of those around you in the Trump administrations, both 1 and 2, is really important for us to try and figure out how do we keep this on track and deepen the relationship that's been so important. Thank you for your time and thank you for your candor.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.